The dust hung thick in the air that August afternoon, coating everything in Dry Creek with a fine layer of grit that turned the world sepia. Margaret Rose Bennett pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of Henderson's general store, trying to make herself invisible as she watched her father stumble out of the Silver Dollar Saloon across the street. Even from this distance, she could see the familiar red flush creeping up Thomas Bennett's neck, the telltale sign that whiskey had loosened his temper again. She should have been home an hour ago, but the bruises from last week hadn't quite faded to yellow yet, and she'd lingered at the store, pretending to examine bolts of calico she could never afford while Mrs. Henderson cast sympathetic glances her way. Everyone in Dry Creek knew about Thomas Bennett's heavy hands. They also knew to look the other way. Margaret Rose. Her father's voice cracked like a whip across the dusty main street. "You get yourself over here, girl." Her stomach clenched. 20 years old and still cowering like a child. She'd seen other girls her age married already, setting up households of their own. But Thomas Bennett had made it clear that his daughter would stay put until he decided otherwise. No man in town dared court her anyway, not with her father's reputation. "I'm coming, Pa," she called, forcing her feet to move. Each step felt like walking through molasses, her body remembering every blow that had come before. The street was busy for a Tuesday. Miners heading to the claims, cowboys driving cattle through, merchants hawking their wares, 100 pairs of eyes that would see what came next, and not a single soul who would intervene. That was the way of things in Dry Creek. Thomas Bennett stood swaying slightly in front of the saloon, his work shirt stained with sweat and dirt from the mines. He'd been a handsome man once, before disappointment and drink had carved cruel lines into his face. Margaret Rose's mother had died birthing her, and Thomas never let her forget that she'd cost him the only woman he'd ever loved. "Where you been, girl?" He grabbed her arm as she approached, fingers digging into flesh that was already mottled purple and green. "I told you to have supper ready by 5. I was just getting supplies. Pa, The first blow came without warning, his open palm connecting with her cheek, hard enough to snap her head sideways. The familiar taste of copper flooded her mouth. Around them, conversation stuttered and stopped, then resumed in hushed tones. A woman hurried her children past, shielding their eyes. "Don't you sass me," Thomas roared, spittle flying. "Think you're too good to mind your father? Think you can shame me in front of the whole town?" Margaret Rose didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that words only made it worse, but her silence seemed to enrage him further. He grabbed a fistful of her dark hair, yanking her forward until she stumbled to her knees in the dirt. "Pa, please," she whispered, hating the break in her voice. "Not here." "Not here?" He laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "You worried about your reputation, girl." "What reputation? Everyone knows you're nothing but a burden, a curse that killed your mother." The crowd had grown now. Men lounged against porch posts, making no move to help but eager for the spectacle. Women clutched their shawls tighter and murmured to each other behind gloved hands. Margaret Rose caught glimpses of faces she'd known all her life. The banker Mr. Morrison, whose wife sometimes slipped her peppermint candies. Old Sam from the livery stable who'd taught her to gentle horses. Mrs. Palmer from the boarding house who'd once offered her a job that her father had forbidden her to take. None of them moved. Thomas hauled her to her feet, shaking her like a rag doll. Her bonnet fell off, pins scattering in the dust, and her hair tumbled loose around her shoulders. "You're lucky I keep you at all," he snarled. "No man would want you anyway. Skinny as a fence post, useless as your mother was." Another blow, this time with his fist closed. Stars exploded behind Margaret Rose's eyes as she fell again, her palms scraping against the ground. She could hear her own breathing, ragged and loud in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the street. "Get up," Thomas ordered. "We're going home, and you're going to learn to show proper respect." She struggled to her hands and knees, blood dripping from her nose onto the packed earth. The humiliation burned worse than the pain. She was a grown woman, reduced to crawling in the dirt while the whole town watched. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back fiercely. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. A child somewhere in the crowd whimpered, quickly hushed by its mother. The sound seemed to please Thomas, who grabbed Margaret Rose's arm again, hauling her upright. "That's right," he announced to the gathered townsfolk. "You all teach your children what happens when they forget their place. The Bible says honor thy father, and by God, she'll learn to honor me if I have to beat it into her." Margaret Rose kept her eyes down, unable to bear the weight of all those stares. She could feel their judgment, their pity, their relief that it wasn't them. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat mixed with blood on her face. Her ribs ached where he'd kicked her last Tuesday, the bruises protesting this fresh assault. "Anyone got something to say?" Thomas challenged, sweeping his bloodshot gaze across the crowd. "Anyone think they know better how a man should handle his own family?" Silence. Even the dogs had stopped barking. That's when Margaret Rose heard it, the soft jingle of spurs, different from the familiar sound of cowboy boots. She lifted her head slightly and saw him standing at the edge of the crowd, still as a statue carved from shadow. The Apache warrior stood apart from everyone else, not just in distance, but in bearing. While the townspeople shifted and whispered, he remained motionless, watching. Margaret Rose had seen him before, trading furs at Henderson's store, watering his horse at the trough. The children called him the Savage and threw stones when their parents weren't looking. The adults simply pretended he didn't exist, but he was watching now. And something in his dark eyes made Margaret Rose's breath catch. It wasn't pity she saw there. It was something harder, sharper, like flint ready to strike sparks. Thomas hadn't noticed him yet, too drunk and too focused on his public display of authority. He raised his hand again, ready to deliver another blow to drive his lesson home. The Apache took a single step forward. The Apache warrior moved through the crowd like water through stone, fluid and inevitable. People stumbled back without quite knowing why, creating a path where none had existed before. He wore traditional dress mixed with practical frontier clothing, deerskin leggings, a cotton shirt, a leather vest adorned with intricate beadwork. His hair fell long and black past his shoulders, held back by a simple leather cord. A knife rested at his hip, along with a cavalry pistol that spoke of pragmatism rather than tradition. Margaret Rose had heard the stories. They called him Silent Crow, though she doubted that was his real name. The townspeople said he'd lost his entire band to soldiers 5 winters ago, that he wandered alone now, neither fully part of the white world nor able to return to what remained of his people. Some said he was dangerous, others said he was broken. But looking at him now, Margaret Rose saw neither danger nor brokenness. She saw controlled power, leashed but ready. Thomas Bennett still hadn't noticed the approaching figure, too caught up in his drunken righteousness. His hand was descending again when a voice cut through the air like a blade through silk. "Enough!" The single word wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of mountains, the force of rivers, the finality of winter's first snow. Thomas's hand froze mid-swing. Silent Crow stood 3 feet away, close enough that Margaret Rose could see the fine lines around his eyes, the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. She'd heard he was maybe 35, though his face held the ageless quality of carved stone. His eyes were the deepest brown she'd ever seen, almost black. And right now they were fixed on Thomas Bennett with an intensity that made her father take an involuntary step back. "She's mine now," Silent Crow said, his English carefully pronounced but firm. The silence that followed was complete. Even the wind seemed to stop, holding its breath along with every soul on that dusty street. Margaret Rose felt her heart hammering against her ribs, each beat loud as thunder in her ears. Thomas Bennett's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. "What did you say? Savage?" Silent Crow didn't repeat himself. He simply stood there, immovable as the mountains that rose beyond the town limits. His hand rested casually near his knife, but the threat wasn't in the weapon. It was in his presence, in the way he occupied space, as if he had every right to it. "This is none of your concern," Thomas finally managed, though his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "This is family business, white man's business." "No!" Silent Crow's gaze never wavered. "A man who beats a woman in the street has no claim to family. She is under my protection now." The crowd stirred, whispers rising like wind through grass. Margaret Rose caught fragments. "Can't just... Who does he think? Thomas won't stand for..." But Thomas was swaying on his feet, confusion and rage warring on his flushed face. "You can't... She's my daughter, my property. The law..." "Your law." Silent Crow's voice held a note of something that might have been contempt. "Your law that watches a woman bleed and does nothing. I follow older laws." Sheriff Watson had appeared at the edge of the crowd, his hand resting on his pistol, but he made no move to intervene. Caught between his duty to maintain order and the unwritten rule that family disputes were private matters. Besides, everyone knew he owed Thomas money from last month's poker game. Margaret Rose found herself holding her breath. No one had ever stood up to her father before. No one had ever suggested she was anything more than his property, to dispose of as he wished. The idea that she could be under protection of anyone, let alone this silent warrior, was so foreign she couldn't quite grasp it. "You think you can just take her?" Thomas laughed, but it was high and nervous. "What are you going to do? Savage? Buy her? Trade some furs for her like she's a horse?" Silent Crow took a step forward. Just one, but Thomas stumbled back as if pushed. "I take nothing. I offer sanctuary. The choice is hers." Every eye turned to Margaret Rose. She knelt still in the dirt, blood drying on her face, her dress torn at the shoulder. The weight of their attention was crushing. She'd never been asked to choose anything in her life. Her father had decided everything: what she wore, what she ate, who she could speak to, where she could go. "Margaret Rose!" Her father's voice turned wheedling, the tone he used after the worst beatings, when he'd cry and promise it would never happen again. "You wouldn't shame your poor old father like this. Your mother would turn in her grave. Come on home, girl. I'll make your favorite stew." She looked at him, this man who'd raised her with fists and cruel words, who'd isolated her from any chance at a normal life. Then she looked at Silent Crow, this stranger who'd stepped forward when no one else would. "He's a savage," someone in the crowd muttered. "No decent white woman would..." "Decent?" Silent Crow's voice cut through the murmur. He addressed the crowd now, his English growing more fluid with emotion. "You speak of decency? You who watch a father draw blood from his child and call it righteous? You who turn away when she cries for help because it is not your business? Where is your decency, Mrs.?" Henderson clutched her husband's arm. Her face red. "Mister." Morrison studied his shoes. Even Sheriff Watson looked uncomfortable. "The Apache," Silent Crow continued. "Do not strike women. A man who cannot control his temper is not a man but a rabid dog. We put down rabid dogs." The threat was implicit, but clear. Thomas's face went from red to purple. "You threatening me? Indian." "I am stating fact." Silent Crow turned his attention back to Margaret Rose. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You have suffered enough. Come with me, and you will suffer no more. This I swear on the bones of my ancestors." Margaret Rose's throat was dry as sand. She tried to speak, coughed, tried again. I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "But you know him." He gestured to Thomas without looking at him. "Which unknown do you choose?" It was, she realized, the first real choice she'd ever been offered. Stay with the devil she knew, who would beat her until she died, or he did, who would never let her marry, or leave, or have a life of her own, or go with this stranger who might be dangerous in entirely different ways, but who had at least shown her the courtesy of acknowledging she was a person who could choose. Margaret Rose. Thomas started forward, but Silent Crow shifted slightly, and her father stopped. "I'm your father. You belong with me. What would people say? You'd be ruined. No decent man would have you after. No decent man has her now." Silent Crow interrupted. "You have seen to that." The truth of it hit Margaret Rose like cold water. Her father had made sure no one in town would court her, had spread stories about her being simple-minded, willful, unmarriageable. She was 20 years old with no prospects, no future except more of the same. More bruises, more humiliation, more nights crying into her thin pillow, wishing her mother had lived or that she had died with her. She looked around at the faces of people she'd known all her life. Not one of them met her eyes. They'd watched her father beat her in the street, and they'd done nothing. They would watch him beat her tomorrow, and they would do nothing. And one day, they would watch him beat her to death, and they would shake their heads and say what a shame it was. But family business was family business. Silent Crow extended his hand, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. His palm was calloused from weapons and reins, but steady, patient. "Choose," he said simply. The words hung in the air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. "She's mine now." 3 simple words that shattered the unspoken rules of Dry Creek like a stone through glass. Margaret Rose watched the ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Women clutched their children closer. Men's hands drifted to their weapons. The very foundations of their ordered world had been challenged by this Apache warrior who dared to claim what Thomas Bennett considered his by right of blood and law. "You can't be serious," Thomas sputtered, his face cycling through shades of red and purple. "Sheriff Watson, are you going to let this savage—" "Now hold on, Thomas," the sheriff interrupted, clearly uncomfortable. He was a thin man with a drooping mustache, more comfortable breaking up saloon fights than navigating the dangerous ground between race and domestic authority. "The Indian hasn't broken any law that I can see." "Hasn't broken any law?" Thomas's voice rose to a near shriek. "He's trying to steal my daughter." "Steal?" Silent Crow's voice remained level, but Margaret Rose could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his weight shifted slightly onto the balls of his feet. "I steal nothing. I offer freedom to one who has none. If this is theft, then your entire nation is built on it." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded reluctantly. Everyone knew the Apache had been pushed from their lands. Others bristled at the comparison. The banker, Mr. Morrison, stepped forward, his gold watch chain glinting in the sun. "See here," he said in his most officious voice. "This is highly irregular. Miss Bennett is a white woman, a Christian woman. She can't simply go off with a heathen." "It isn't done." "What isn't done?" Silent Crow replied, "is standing by while a woman is beaten bloody for sport. Yet you all seem practiced at it." Mrs. Palmer from the boarding house spoke up, her voice shrill with indignation. "Thomas Bennett is her father. The Bible says—" "I have read your Bible," Silent Crow interrupted, causing another stir. Few expected an Apache to be literate. "It also says to love thy neighbor, to show mercy, to protect the weak. Which of these commands do you follow today?" Margaret Rose remained frozen on her knees, watching this unprecedented scene unfold. Part of her wanted to run, from her father, from this stranger, from the weight of all these eyes upon her. But there was nowhere to run to. This was the only world she knew, and it had never offered her sanctuary before. "You're all missing the point," Thomas said, trying to regain control. "She's simple-minded, touched in the head. She can't make decisions for herself. Tell them, Margaret Rose. Tell them how you need your PA to take care of you." The old humiliation burned fresh. How many times had he told that lie? How many potential suitors had been warned away with whispers about her supposed deficiency? She raised her head, meeting his bloodshot eyes for perhaps the first time in years. "I'm not simple-minded," she said quietly. The words seemed to shock Thomas more than Silent Crow's challenge had. "What did you say?" "I said I'm not simple-minded." Her voice grew stronger. "I can read and write and figure better than half the men in this town. Mrs. Henderson knows. She's seen me help with the store accounts when you're too drunk to notice." Mrs. Henderson flushed but nodded reluctantly. "It's true. The girl has a good head for numbers." "You shut your mouth." Thomas snarled at his daughter. "You see, willful and disobedient. She needs a firm hand." "A firm hand?" Silent Crow gestured to Margaret Rose's battered face. "Is this what you call firm, in my people's tongue?" We have another word for it. We call it cowardice. Thomas lunged forward then, all drunken rage and wounded pride. But Silent Crow moved like water, stepping aside and letting the bigger man's momentum carry him past. Thomas stumbled, nearly fell, caught himself against a hitching post. When he turned back, his face was murderous. "You'll pay for that, savage! This whole town will see you hang—" "For what?" Sheriff Watson stepped between them, looking miserable but duty-bound. "For stepping aside when you charged him. Thomas, you're drunk. Go home and sleep it off. Without my daughter. Your daughter is a grown woman," Silent Crow said, "old enough to choose her own path. In my culture, she would have been considered an adult for many seasons now. Only in your world is a woman of 20 summers still a child in her father's house." The crowd was growing restless. This had gone beyond the usual street theater into something more dangerous, a challenge to the very order of their society. Margaret Rose could see it in their faces, the fear that if one woman could simply choose to leave, what would stop their own daughters, their own wives? "This is madness," someone called out. "Next you'll have every dissatisfied female running off with the first Indian who makes promises." "Promises?" Silent Crow's eyes narrowed. "I promise only what I can give. Safety, respect, freedom to be more than a man's property. If these simple things would empty your town of women, perhaps you should examine why." That struck too close to home. Several men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew that Jake Morrison beat his wife behind closed doors, that Carl Henderson had driven his eldest daughter away with his strictness, that half the marriages in Dry Creek were more prison than partnership. Margaret Rose watched it all with a kind of detached wonder. This stranger, this Apache warrior who had no stake in their community, was saying all the things she'd thought but never dared voice. He was holding up a mirror to Dry Creek, and the town didn't like what it saw. "Enough talk," Thomas declared, straightening up with effort. "Margaret Rose, you get up right now and come home, or I'll—" "You'll what?" Silent Crow asked softly. "Beat her again? Here? Now? Show everyone what a big man you are." Thomas's hand went to the old Navy Colt at his hip. The crowd drew back, suddenly aware that this could turn deadly. Sheriff Watson's hand found his own weapon, though he looked uncertain who he'd be drawing on. "Pa, no!" Margaret Rose gasped, but Silent Crow didn't move, didn't reach for his own weapons. He simply stood there, watching Thomas with those dark, fathomless eyes. "You would shoot an unarmed man for speaking truth? This is your Christian virtue?" "You're armed," Thomas protested, gesturing wildly at the knife and pistol at Silent Crow's belt. "Am I?" Silent Crow slowly, deliberately, unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground. He removed the knife sheath and set it aside as well. "Now I am not. Will you shoot me now? Show your daughter what kind of man her father truly is." The challenge hung between them. Margaret Rose held her breath, knowing her father's temper, knowing how whiskey made him reckless. But shooting an unarmed man in front of dozens of witnesses, even an Indian, was a line that once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. "This ain't over," Thomas finally growled, his hand falling away from his gun. "You can't just take her. There's laws. Then use them," Silent Crow said simply. "But until then, she is under my protection. Any who would harm her must answer to me." He turned back to Margaret Rose then, his expression softening. She realized with a start that throughout this entire confrontation, he'd never lost sight of her, never forgotten that she was a person, not just a prize to be won or lost. "The choice is still yours," he said quietly, pitched for her ears alone. "I will not force what I offer to free you from, but choose you must. The sun grows low, and this place holds nothing for you but more pain." Margaret Rose looked around at the faces of her neighbors, her community, the only world she'd ever known. Not one of them had ever stood up for her like this stranger had. Not one of them had ever suggested she had value beyond her father's property. Her knees hurt from kneeling in the dirt. Her face throbbed where her father had struck her. Her ribs ached with every breath. And she was tired, so deeply, bone-achingly tired of it all. Silent Crow extended his hand once more, palm up, patient as stone. The gesture was simple, but Margaret Rose understood its weight. This was her moment of choosing, the fulcrum on which her entire life would turn. She looked at that offered hand, brown and calloused, steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Then she looked at her father, swaying on his feet, face twisted with rage and disbelief that his authority could be challenged. 20 years of bruises, 20 years of cruel words, 20 years of being told she was worthless, unwanted, a burden that killed her mother by being born. Slowly, Margaret Rose placed her trembling hand in Silent Crow's. The touch was electric, not with romance but with possibility. His fingers closed gently around hers, and with surprising strength that somehow managed to be tender. He helped her to her feet. Her legs shook, whether from kneeling so long or from the magnitude of what she was doing. She couldn't say. "No." Thomas lurched forward, but several men grabbed him, holding him back. Not out of sympathy for Margaret Rose, she knew, but because the situation was already too volatile. A dead Indian would bring investigations, possibly federal marshals, definitely trouble no one wanted. "You're making a mistake," Thomas shouted, struggling against the restraining hands. "You'll be ruined. No decent person will speak to you again. You'll be nothing but an Indian's—" "Thomas, that's enough," Sheriff Watson said firmly. "The girl's made her choice. She can't make choices. She's my daughter." "Not anymore," Silent Crow said quietly. He bent to retrieve his weapons, buckling them back in place with economical movements. Then he turned to address the crowd one final time. "You will remember this day. Not because an Apache took one of your women. I take no one. You will remember because one of your women chose to leave. Ask yourselves why." Margaret Rose felt the weight of their stares, disgust from some, pity from others, and from a few of the younger women, something that might have been envy. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin. Let them look. Let them see her battered face and torn dress. Let them see what their silence had allowed. "Mrs." Henderson stepped forward hesitantly. "Margaret Rose, dear, are you certain? You don't know this man. He could—" "What?" Margaret Rose found her voice at last. "Beat me, humiliate me, keep me prisoner in my own home. Tell me I'm worthless every day until I believe it." She gestured to her father. "I already have that." The older woman flinched but pressed on. "But he's not. He's not one of us. You'll be living as a savage, away from civilization, from Christian society." "Your Christian society watched my father beat me in the street," Margaret Rose said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Your civilization decided it wasn't their business. If that's what you offer, I'll take my chances with so-called savagery." Silent Crow had moved to where a painted horse stood tethered, a beautiful animal with a black and white coat that seemed to shimmer in the late afternoon sun. He untied the reins but made no move to mount, waiting. "You walk out of here with that heathen. You're dead to me." Thomas managed to shout, though the fight was leaving him as the whiskey fog cleared enough for him to realize what was happening. "You hear me, girl? Dead. I have no daughter." Margaret Rose turned to face him one last time. "You never did," she said quietly. "You had a possession, a thing to blame for your sorrows, a target for your fists. But a daughter? No, you never had one of those." The truth of it seemed to strike Thomas like a physical blow. He sagged in the arms of the men holding him, and for just a moment, Margaret Rose saw him as he really was, a broken, bitter man who had driven away the only family he had left. "Come," Silent Crow said gently. "The sun grows low, and we have far to travel." But Margaret Rose hesitated, suddenly aware of practical matters. "I have nothing, no clothes, no—" "You have yourself," he interrupted. "That is enough. The rest can be found or made. Wait, Mrs." Henderson hurried into her store, emerging moments later with a wrapped bundle. "Take this," she said, pressing it into Margaret Rose's hands. "It's not much, but—" She glanced fearfully at Thomas, then back to Margaret Rose. "I should have done more. I'm sorry." Others began to step forward. Not many, but a few. Misses. Palmer handed over a small purse with a few coins. Old Sam from the livery stable offered a canteen of water. Even some who had stood silent during the beating seemed moved by this final moment to offer what small kindnesses they could. "Cowards," Thomas spat, helping her run off with a savage. "You're all cowards." "Perhaps," Sheriff Watson said quietly. "But at least we're not the kind of coward who beats women." Silent Crow had mounted his horse and now extended his hand down to Margaret Rose. It is time. This was it, the final step. Once she mounted that horse, there would be no return. She would be leaving everything she had ever known, going into an uncertain future with a man whose language she didn't speak, whose ways were foreign to her. But what was certainty worth when it promised only pain? Margaret Rose took his hand and let him pull her up behind him on the horse. She had ridden before, secretly, when her father was passed out drunk, but never like this. Never with her arms around a stranger's waist. Never with the entire town watching her choose exile over existence. "Where will you take her?" someone called out. Silent Crow looked back over his shoulder. "Where she can heal. Where she can learn that not all strength comes from fists. Where she can discover who she is when fear no longer rules her days. And if she wants to come back, then she will come back. But it will be her choice, not mine, not yours, not his." He gestured to Thomas, who was now sitting in the dirt, looking suddenly old and defeated. "That is what you cannot understand. Among my people, even in our darkest hours, choice is sacred." He turned the horse, and Margaret Rose found herself facing the open desert beyond the town, vast and golden in the slanting light. Fear coursed through her, fear of the unknown, fear of leaving, fear that she was making a terrible mistake. But beneath the fear was something else, something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten its name. Hope. Margaret Rose, her father's voice, one last time. But now it sounded more plea than command. "Don't leave me. I'm all alone. Your mother's gone. And now you—" She looked back at him. This man who had made her life a misery, who had beaten and belittled her, who had tried to break her spirit day by day. And she felt, unexpectedly, a twist of pity. "You were always alone, Pa," she said softly. "You just made sure I was alone with you." Then Silent Crow urged the horse forward, and they began to move. Not fast, a walk at first, giving her time to change her mind, to leap down and run back to the prison she knew. The crowd parted before them, faces blurring together, shock, disapproval, curiosity, and yes, on some of the women's faces, a wistful understanding. As they reached the edge of town, Silent Crow spoke without turning. "You are afraid." It wasn't a question, but Margaret Rose answered anyway. "Yes? Good. Fear means you understand the weight of your choice, but do not let fear choose for you. How do you know I won't run back the moment you sleep?" "Because," he said simply, "you have already lived that life, and you are still breathing. Which means some part of you still believes in tomorrow." They passed the last building, the church, its white steeple pointing toward heaven like an accusation. Margaret Rose thought of all the Sundays she'd sat in those pews, praying for deliverance that never came, while bruises hidden beneath her best dress ached with each hymn. The open desert stretched before them now, painted in shades of gold and red as the sun began its descent. Behind them, she could hear the town stirring back to life. Voices raised in argument about what had just transpired. By tomorrow, she would be the talk of every household, her name synonymous with scandal, but tomorrow she would be somewhere else. Someone else. Maybe not Thomas Bennett's daughter, not Dry Creek's shame, just Margaret Rose, whoever that turned out to be. The horse's gait was smooth, rhythmic. Silent Crow rode with the easy grace of someone born to it. Margaret Rose realized she didn't even know where they were going, didn't know anything about this man except that he had stood up when no one else would. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate but necessary. He was quiet for so long she thought he hadn't heard. Then, "Do not thank me yet. The path ahead is hard, but it is a path, not a cage. That is all I offer. A path." Not a cage. After 20 years, it sounded like paradise. As Dry Creek disappeared into the desert haze behind them, Margaret Rose Bennett closed her eyes and, for the first time in memory, breathed free. The desert transformed as darkness fell. What had been harsh and forbidding in daylight became a landscape of silver shadows and surprising coolness. Stars emerged one by one, then in rushing multitudes, until the sky blazed with more light than Margaret Rose had ever seen from her small window in town. They had ridden for hours in silence, stopping only once at a hidden spring where Silent Crow watered the horse and refilled the canteen. He'd offered it to her first, watching as she drank, then dampened misses. Henderson's spare kerchief to gently clean the dried blood from her face. His touch was clinical, but kind, and she found herself fighting tears at the simple courtesy of it. Now they climbed into the foothills, following paths invisible to her eyes but clear to his. The painted horse picked its way carefully among the rocks, sure-footed despite the darkness. Pine trees began to appear, their resinous scent sharp and clean after the dust of the desert. "We stop here," Silent Crow announced, guiding the horse into a small clearing protected on 3 sides by massive boulders. A ring of old firestones suggested this was a regular camp. Margaret Rose slid from the horse, her legs nearly buckling. Every muscle ached, and the places where her father had struck her throbbed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She stood uncertainly, watching as Silent Crow moved with practiced efficiency, unsaddling the horse, gathering wood, creating a small fire that gave warmth without too much smoke. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a flat stone near the fire. "You need food and rest." She sat, pulling her torn shawl closer. Now that they'd stopped moving, the reality of her situation crashed over her like a cold wave. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she didn't know, miles from anything familiar, with nothing but the clothes on her back and Henderson's small bundle. "Are you going to—" She stopped, unable to voice her fears. Silent Crow paused in unpacking his saddlebags and looked at her directly. "Am I going to what? Speak your fear. It has less power in the open." "Are you going to hurt me?" The words came out in a whisper. He was quiet for a long moment, then sat back on his heels. "Among my people, a woman is sacred. She brings life, tends the home fire, keeps the stories. A man who forces himself on a woman is lower than a dog. Dogs at least follow their nature. Such a man betrays his— But I'm not your people." "No," he agreed. "But you are under my protection. This means your safety is my honor. I will die before I let harm come to you, from others or from myself." The simple certainty in his voice made her throat tight. "Why? Why did you do it? You don't know me?" Silent Crow returned to his work, pulling out dried meat, flatbread, and a leather pouch of something that smelled like herbs. "I knew enough. I knew you were being beaten while others watched. I knew you had no one to stand for you. Among my people, this would be—" He paused, searching for words. "It would be a tear in the fabric of the world, something that must be mended." He prepared a simple meal, heating water in a small pot, adding herbs that made a fragrant tea. The dried meat was tough but satisfying, the bread filling. Margaret Rose ate slowly, her split lip making each bite painful. "You spoke of your people," she ventured. "But you're alone." His hands stilled for just a moment. "Yes." When he didn't elaborate, she pressed gently. "The town says— They say soldiers killed your band. The town says many things. Some are even true." He stared into the fire, and for the first time, she saw the weight he carried. 5 winters ago, we were camped near Bitter Creek. Peaceful. We had signed their papers, stayed on their reservation, but there was gold in the hills, and gold speaks louder than treaties. Margaret Rose knew about the gold rush, the conflicts it had sparked, but hearing it from this side made her stomach turn. "They came at dawn. I was hunting, bringing back deer for the winter stores. I heard the guns." He stopped, jaw tight. "When I returned, there was nothing left. My wife, my daughter, my mother and sisters, all gone." "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words pathetically inadequate. Your sorrow cannot bring them back, but perhaps— He looked at her then, really looked at her. Perhaps saving one life begins to balance the scales. The spirits work in ways we cannot always understand. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Margaret Rose pulled out Mrs. Henderson's bundle, finding a clean dress, some basic necessities. And at the bottom, a small Bible. She almost laughed at the irony. "You can read this?" Silent Crow asked, noticing the book. "Yes, my mother taught me before she died. It was the only thing Father couldn't take from me, what was already in my head." "Then you are wealthy indeed. Knowledge is the only treasure that cannot be stolen." She fingered the worn leather cover. "Do you really read it? The Bible?" "The missionaries were very insistent," he said with a slight smile that transformed his stern features. "They came to save our heathen souls. I learned their language, their book, their ways. I thought understanding would build a bridge between our peoples." The smile faded. "I was young. I believed understanding was enough. And now I know that understanding without respect is worthless. Your people understood that we had land they wanted, but they did not respect our right to it." Margaret Rose thought of her father, how he'd understood she was a person but hadn't respected her humanity. The parallel was uncomfortable but undeniable. "You're cold," Silent Crow observed. She hadn't realized she was shivering until he mentioned it. He retrieved a blanket from his pack, not the rough wool she expected, but something soft, decorated with intricate patterns. "This is beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the weaving. "My wife made it," he said quietly. "She was known for her skill. I carry it to remember. But tonight, it serves life instead of memory. She would approve." He draped it around her shoulders with careful hands, never touching her directly. The blanket smelled of sage and smoke and something indefinable. The scent of a life lived close to the earth. "Where are we going?" Margaret Rose asked. "I mean, tomorrow and after. Where will we end up?" "There is a place in the mountains, 2 days' ride, a valley hidden from white men's maps. Others live there, Apache, some Mexicans, a few whites who have chosen different paths. It is not paradise, but it is peaceful. You will be safe there while you decide." "Decide what?" "Who you wish to become. You are no longer Thomas Bennett's daughter, so who is Margaret Rose when she stands alone?" The question terrified her. She'd never been allowed to wonder who she might be beyond her father's shadow. "I don't know," she admitted. "Good. Knowing too quickly means choosing too small. You have time now, time to heal, to learn, to grow, time to discover if Margaret Rose has iron in her spine or flowers in her heart, perhaps both. And you, will you stay in this valley?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I have been wandering since the massacre, following old paths, trading, existing but not living. Perhaps it is time I also remembered who I am beyond grief." A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. The sound should have frightened her, but somehow it only emphasized the vast freedom of this place. No walls, no locked doors, no drunken footsteps to fear. "You should sleep," Silent Crow said. "Tomorrow's journey is longer." He showed her how to arrange the blanket and her spare dress into a comfortable bed near the fire, then moved to the other side, giving her space. She watched him settle against a boulder, his weapons within reach, but his posture relaxed. "You'll freeze," she protested. "I have slept in worse places, and you need warmth more than I. Your body has been through much today." She lay down, marveling at how different the stars looked out here, in town. They'd seemed distant, dimmed by lamplight and smoke. Here, they pressed close, intimate as whispered secrets. "Silent Crow," she said softly. "Yes? Is that really your name?" A soft sound that might have been a chuckle. "It is what your people call me. My true name is—" He said something in Apache, liquid syllables she couldn't hope to reproduce. "It means he who walks between worlds, between peoples, between war and peace. But Silent Crow serves well enough." "What should I call you? What do you wish to call me?" She thought about it. "You're not silent. You've spoken more truth today than I've heard in 20 years, and you're not a crow. You don't pick at the dead. You pulled me from a kind of death. Then choose a name that fits what you see." "I'll think on it," she said, surprising herself with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Sleep now," he said gently. "The stars will watch over us, and tomorrow brings new trails." Margaret Rose closed her eyes, expecting fear or worry to keep her awake, but wrapped in a dead woman's beautiful blanket, protected by a grieving warrior's honor, under stars that didn't care about the color of her skin or the scandal of her leaving. She felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. The days that followed blurred together like watercolors in rain. They traveled higher into the mountains, leaving the desert behind for forests of pine and aspen. Margaret Rose learned the rhythm of this new life: wake before dawn, break camp with quiet efficiency, ride through landscapes that stole her breath, make camp as shadows grew long. Silent Crow was a patient teacher without seeming to teach at all. He showed her which plants could be eaten, which streams ran cleanest, how to read weather and cloud formations. When her split lip made eating painful, he made a poultice from plants he gathered, applying it with hands gentle as a mother's. On the third night, camped beside a stream that sang over smooth stones, Margaret Rose finally found courage to voice what had been building inside her. "My mother died when I was born," she said suddenly, staring into the fire. "Father never let me forget it. Said I killed her, coming into the world. Said God marked me as cursed from my first breath." Silent Crow was cleaning his rifle, movements methodical and sure. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush to comfort or contradict. He simply listened. "I used to wonder what she was like. Found an old daguerreotype once, hidden in Father's Bible. She looked kind, gentle, nothing like him." Margaret Rose pulled her knees to her chest. "Sometimes I'd pretend she was still alive, just traveling somewhere, that she'd come back and take me away." "What happened to the picture?" "Father found me looking at it, burned it, said I didn't deserve to see her face." The memory still stung. Years later, that's when the beatings got worse, like he couldn't stand to look at me because I had her eyes. Silent Crow set aside his rifle, giving her his full attention. "Among my people, we believe the spirit chooses its time to walk on. Your mother's spirit chose to leave as yours arrived. This is not curse, it is the turning of the great wheel. One season ends, so another can begin. But if I hadn't been born, then your mother would have found another path to the spirit world. When it is time, death comes whether we invite it or not. You did not kill her any more than spring kills winter." Margaret Rose had never thought of it that way. 20 years of guilt began to shift, just slightly, like ice beginning to crack on a frozen stream. "Your father's grief became poison," Silent Crow continued. "Instead of honoring your mother's memory by cherishing what she left behind, he destroyed it daily. This is his failure, not yours." They sat quietly, listening to the stream's music. Then Margaret Rose asked, "Tell me about your daughter." His face softened in the firelight. "Little Moon. We called her. She had eyes like yours, always watching, always learning. 5 summers old when—" He paused, gathering himself. "She feared nothing. Would walk up to horses twice her height and scold them for eating her grandmother's herbs. Made friends with a raven who would steal shiny things for her. She sounds wonderful. She was all the best parts of her mother and somehow a few good parts of me." He smiled sadly. "I see her sometimes in small things. A certain slant of light, the way a bird tilts its head, the echo of laughter in water falling. Do you think she knows you remember?" "I hope so. We believe the spirits of children stay close to those who love them. Perhaps she led me to that street in your town. Perhaps she whispered, 'Father, see this one who suffers. Remember what you could not do for me.'" Margaret Rose felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Not from sadness, exactly, but from the unexpected gift of being understood. "I'm sorry you lost them, as I'm sorry you lost your mother and never had a true father." He met her eyes across the fire. "But we are here now, 2 spirits marked by loss, finding a path forward. This matters. The next morning brought their first real challenge. The trail narrowed, forcing them to dismount and lead the horse along a ledge with a devastating drop below. Margaret Rose had never been afraid of heights, but this was different. One wrong step meant certain death. "Don't look down," Silent Crow advised, moving ahead with the easy confidence of long practice. "The mountain will not drop you if you respect it. Fear makes us clumsy." She tried to follow his advice, keeping her eyes on the path, one hand on the rock wall, but halfway across, vertigo hit like a physical blow. The world spun. Her knees went weak, and she pressed herself against the stone, unable to move forward or back. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't do this." Silent Crow secured the horse and returned to her, moving along the ledge as if it were a city street. "Look at me," he commanded softly. "Only at me." She forced her eyes open, finding his face, calm, steady, anchoring. "Tell me about your mother's eyes," he said. "What?" The question was so unexpected it broke through her panic. "You said you had her eyes. Tell me about them." They were green, like mine, but darker, like... She searched for words, focusing on his face instead of the drop. "Like pine needles in shadow." "Good. What else did you inherit from her?" He kept her talking, asking gentle questions that required thought, until she found herself moving again, following his voice along the ledge. Only when they reached wider ground did she realize what he'd done. "You distracted me. I reminded you that you are more than your fear." He checked the horse's hooves for stones, casual as if they hadn't just navigated death. "Your body knows how to survive. Sometimes we must quiet the mind to let the body lead." That night they camped early, both exhausted from the tension of the crossing. As Margaret Rose gathered wood, a task she'd taken on without being asked, she found herself humming. The sound surprised her so much she stopped mid-note. When had she last hummed? Or sung? Music had been beaten out of her years ago, when her father decided her voice reminded him too much of her mother's. "Don't stop," Silent Crow said from where he was preparing their meal. "Music heals what words cannot touch. I don't remember the words anymore, just the tune." It was an old lullaby, something her mother must have sung while she still carried her. Then "The mountain likes music." Self-conscious, but oddly safe. She continued humming while she worked. The simple melody seemed to unlock something in her chest, a tightness she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be there. Later, as they ate rabbit stew flavored with wild herbs, Silent Crow said, "Tomorrow we reach the valley. You should know what to expect. Tell me." "It is not large, maybe 30 people in all. Apache who cannot return to the reservation. Mexicans who lost their lands to American laws. A few whites who chose different paths. We have rules, but they are simple. No one owns anyone. Violence against women or children means exile. All work, all eat. All protect the secret of the place. And they'll accept me. You come under my protection. This carries weight, but acceptance is earned, not given. Show them your true heart. Work with willing hands, and you will find your place." "What if I don't belong there either?" He considered this seriously. "Then you will leave and find where you do belong, but you will leave stronger than you arrived, knowing more of who you are. This I promise." That night, Margaret Rose lay awake despite her exhaustion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new faces, new tests, but for the first time in her life, she faced the unknown without dread. Whatever came, she would meet it as herself, not as Thomas Bennett's worthless daughter, but as Margaret Rose, who had found courage to reach for a stranger's hand and step into a new world. "Silent Crow?" she whispered. A soft grunt indicated he was listening. "I've decided what to call you." "Oh?" "Joseph. It means God will increase, because you increased my life when you could have walked by." There was a long pause. Then, quietly, "Joseph. Yes, this is a good name for the man I am becoming again." She smiled in the darkness. They were both becoming new people, shaped by loss but not defined by it. Tomorrow would bring the next step in that becoming. And for the first time in 20 years, Margaret Rose looked forward to tomorrow. 6 weeks had passed in the mountain valley. 6 weeks of healing and discovery. Margaret Rose's hands had grown calloused from real work, her skin bronzed by mountain sun, her body strong from hauling water and tending gardens. The woman who looked back from the stream's surface bore little resemblance to the ghost who'd fled Dry Creek. But ghosts have a way of returning when you least expect them. She was grinding corn with Maria, an older Mexican woman who'd taken her under her wing. When the warning whistle came, 3 sharp notes that meant strangers approaching. The valley had several hidden watchers who kept vigil on the few paths leading in. "Inside," Maria ordered, shoving Margaret Rose toward her cabin. "Until we know who—" From the window, Margaret Rose watched riders emerge from the tree line. Her blood turned to ice water. Thomas Bennett rode at the front, flanked by 6 men she recognized from town, hard cases who'd do anything for coin. They'd found her. Somehow, they'd found her. Joseph appeared from nowhere, as he often did, placing a calming hand on her shoulder. "Breathe," he said quietly. "You are not alone this time." The riders were met at the valley's entrance by Walking Bear, the unofficial leader of their small community, and several armed men. Margaret Rose couldn't hear the words, but she could see her father's gestures growing more aggressive, his face redder even from a distance. "How?" she whispered. "How did they find us?" "Gold speaks louder than loyalty," Joseph said grimly. "Someone in the nearest trading post must have seen us, sold the information." The confrontation at the entrance grew heated. One of Bennett's men reached for his gun, only to find 3 Apache rifles trained on him. The standoff stretched taut as wire. "They'll leave," Margaret Rose said, trying to convince herself. "They have to leave." But Joseph's face told a different story. "Your father has come too far to leave empty-handed. He brings men who kill for sport. This will not end with words." Walking Bear was approaching the main cluster of buildings, Thomas Bennett beside him, the other riders following under heavy guard. Margaret Rose's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd been foolish to think she could simply disappear, that her father would let her go. "Stay inside," Joseph commanded, checking his weapons. "No matter what you hear." But as he turned to leave, Margaret Rose caught his arm. "No, I won't hide anymore. This is my fight. This is not about fighting. This is about keeping you safe." "And what happens next time? And the time after that?" She stood straighter, finding steel in her spine she didn't know existed. "I ran once. I won't run again." Something shifted in Joseph's dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. "Then we face this together. But stay behind me. Your father came for blood." They emerged into the harsh afternoon light. The small community had gathered, forming a protective semicircle. Margaret Rose saw her friends among them, Maria clutching a rifle with practiced ease, young Samuel who'd been teaching her to track, White Dove who'd shown her which plants eased pain. They stood ready to defend her, these people who barely knew her but had accepted her as one of their own. Thomas Bennett's eyes found her immediately. "There you are," he slurred, though it was barely past noon. "My wayward daughter, time to come home." "I am home," Margaret Rose said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Home? With these savages and outcasts?" He spat in the dirt. "You've shamed me, girl, shamed our family name. But I'm a forgiving man. Come back now, and we'll say no more about it." "No." The simple word hung in the air like a challenge. Thomas's face darkened. "You don't tell me no, girl. I'm your father. You belong to me by law and by God." "Your law," Joseph said, stepping partially in front of Margaret Rose. "Your God. Neither holds power here. You." Thomas's hand dropped to his gun. "You're the one who started this, filling her head with ideas, making her forget her place. Her place is where she chooses to stand." Walking Bear interjected. His English was heavily accented but clear. "This is sovereign land. Your laws do not reach here. One of Bennett's men laughed harshly. Sovereign land. You're nothing but a bunch of renegades hiding in the hills. One word to the army and they'll clean you out like rats. Perhaps. Walking Bear agreed calmly. But you would not live to speak that word. The threat was delivered without heat. A simple statement of fact that seemed to chill even the hardened gunmen. They shifted nervously, suddenly aware they were outnumbered and outpositioned, with the rifles trained on them from multiple vantage points. I didn't come here to fight, Thomas said, trying a different approach. I came for what's mine. Margaret Rose. Your place is with your family. Your mother would want— Don't! Margaret Rose's voice cracked like a whip. Don't you dare invoke her name. She died trying to bring me into this world, and you've spent 20 years punishing me for it. You don't get to speak for her. Everything I did was for your own good. To make you strong, to teach you respect. To break me, she interrupted. To make me as small and bitter as you, but I'm not broken anymore. Father, I'm not afraid anymore. It was true, she realized with wonder. Standing here, surrounded by people who valued her, who saw her worth beyond her usefulness as a target for rage. She felt no fear, only a sort of sad pity for the man who'd driven away the only family he had. You'll come back, Thomas snarled, abandoning pretense. When winter comes and you're cold and hungry, when these savages show their true nature, you'll come crawling back, begging, if she returns to your town. Joseph said quietly, It will be as a free woman, not as property. And if you have touched her again, if there is one new bruise on her body, I will find you. This is not a threat. It is a promise made on the bones of my daughter, who I could not protect. Something in his tone must have penetrated even Thomas's whiskey-soaked brain, because he took an involuntary step back. The men with him exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the wisdom of this expedition. This ain't over, Thomas declared, but the fight was leaving his voice. She's my blood, my daughter. No, Margaret Rose said softly. I was never your daughter. I was your victim. There's a difference. The words seemed to break something in him. For just a moment, she saw him clearly. A lonely, angry man who'd lost everything he'd ever loved and had spent 20 years ensuring he'd lose even more. Then the moment passed, and his face hardened again. You're dead to me. He spat. You hear? Dead. I have no daughter. You never did, she replied, echoing her words from that day in Dry Creek. Go home, Father. Go home and try to find peace, but find it without me. Thomas turned to his men. We're leaving. When one of them started to protest, he snarled, Now! They mounted up, Thomas taking one last look at his daughter. She stood tall, no longer the cowering girl he'd controlled through fear. Whatever he saw in her face made him wheel his horse sharply and spur it toward the valley entrance. The community watched in tense silence until the riders disappeared into the trees. Only when the all-clear whistle came did people begin to disperse, voices rising in relief and anger. They'll be back, someone said. With more men, or with the army. Maybe, Walking Bear agreed. But today, they left. Today, we stood together. This matters. Margaret Rose felt her knees go weak as the adrenaline faded. Joseph steadied her, his hand warm on her elbow. You did well, he said simply. I thought I'd be more afraid. Fear is not weakness, but you found something stronger than fear? What? Purpose, family, home. He gestured to the people around them, already returning to their daily tasks, but throwing supportive glances her way. These things make us brave. That evening, the community gathered for a meal, as they did most nights, but tonight felt different. Margaret Rose noticed how people included her in conversations, how the children brought her flowers, how the women touched her shoulder in passing. She'd proven herself, not through violence, but through choosing to stand rather than run. He might really bring the army, she said quietly to Joseph as they sat by the fire. He might, Joseph agreed. But the army has bigger concerns than one runaway daughter, and we have survived worse threats than angry fathers. I'm sorry I brought trouble to your door. He turned to look at her fully. You brought life to this valley, Before you came, I was a ghost walking among the living. Now I remember why we fight to survive, not just to draw another breath, but to protect what matters." Maria approached with her guitar, and soon music filled the night air. Songs in Spanish, Apache, and English wove together, creating something new and beautiful. Margaret Rose found herself pulled into a dance, laughing as she tried to follow the steps she didn't know. Later, as the fire burned low and people drifted to their homes, she sat with Joseph in comfortable silence. The stars wheeled overhead, unchanged by the day's drama. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we prepare. We post more guards. We make plans for if they return. But we also live. We plant corn and hunt deer and teach children and dance under stars. We do not let fear of tomorrow steal today." Margaret Rose thought about that, about choosing life over fear, about standing ground instead of running, about finding family in unexpected places. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a broken thing, property of a cruel man. Tonight, she was her own person, part of a community that valued her strength instead of trying to break it. "Joseph." "Yes?" "Thank you for seeing me when no one else would, for giving me the chance to see myself." He smiled, a rare full smile that transformed his weathered face. "You always had the strength, Margaret Rose. You just needed space to let it grow." The fire crackled, sending sparks into the vast night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Thomas might return, the army might come, winter would test them all. But tonight, Margaret Rose sat free under the stars, surrounded by chosen family, no longer afraid of tomorrow. She was home. Dawn broke over the valley in shades of rose and gold, painting the mountains with light that seemed to promise new beginnings. Margaret Rose stood at the edge of the garden she'd helped plant, watching the sun climb above the peaks. 3 months had passed since her father's visit. 3 months of peace that had allowed her to grow roots as surely as the corn stalking up from the earth. She heard Joseph's footsteps before she saw him, had learned to recognize his particular rhythm. Steady, purposeful, almost silent. He moved like the mountain cats that sometimes appeared at twilight, with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime living close to danger. "You're up early," he observed, coming to stand beside her. "I like this time," she said, "before the world fully wakes. It feels possible." He understood, as he always seemed to. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the light strengthen, until he spoke again. "Margaret Rose, there is something we should speak of." She turned to him, noting the unusual formality in his tone. "What is it? You have been here 3 months. You have found your strength, your voice, your place among us. But I wonder, what do you want now? Where does your path lead?" The question caught her off guard. For so long, survival had been her only goal. Now, with safety achieved, the future stretched before her full of choices she'd never imagined having. "I don't know," she admitted. "For 20 years, someone else decided my path. Now that I can choose." She spread her hands helplessly. "There is no rush," Joseph said gently. "But I ask because—" He paused, seeming to gather words like a man gathering courage. "Because my own path has become unclear since you arrived." Margaret Rose's heart began to beat faster. Over the months, she'd become aware of a change between them. What had begun as protector and protected had shifted into something deeper. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her breath catch. She found herself seeking his presence, feeling incomplete when he was away hunting or trading. "What do you mean?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Joseph turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious. "Among my people, when a man wishes to court a woman, he must first know his own heart and speak it clearly. I have mourned my wife and daughter for 5 years. I thought my heart was ashes, capable only of grief. But you—" He reached out, not quite touching her face. "You have brought green things to grow in that burned place." Margaret Rose felt tears prick her eyes. "Joseph, I do not speak of this to pressure you." He continued quickly. "You are free, and you must remain free." But I would be less than honest if I did not say that I have come to care for you. Not as a guardian cares for his ward, but as a man cares for a woman who makes him remember joy. She thought of all the small moments that had built to this, his gentle teaching, his quiet protection, the way he laughed at her attempts to speak Apache, how he trusted her with his grief and his memories. She thought of how safe she felt beside him, but more than safe, seen, valued, cherished, even. "I care for you too," she whispered. "But I'm frightened. Not of you," she added quickly as his face changed. "Of myself, of not knowing how to be, how to love without losing myself. Love should not diminish you," Joseph said firmly. "True love makes you more yourself, not less. What we could have together. It would be partnership, equality, respect, never ownership. The others, will they accept it? A white woman and an Apache man. This valley exists for those who don't fit the world's narrow paths. Maria married an Apache warrior. Samuel's parents were Chinese and Mexican. We make our own ways here." Margaret Rose looked out over the valley that had become home, then back at this man who had given her freedom and asked nothing in return. "I need time," she said finally. "Not to know my feelings, those are clear, but to know myself fully first. Will you wait?" Joseph smiled, that rare, transformative expression. "I have waited 5 years to feel anything but grief. I can wait longer for something worth having." As if the mountains themselves had been holding their breath. The morning suddenly erupted with shouts and warning whistles. Riders approaching, many of them. "Inside," Joseph commanded. All softness gone, replaced by the warrior. But Margaret Rose was already moving, not to hide but to arm herself. She'd learned to shoot over the past months, and her rifle was loaded and ready. Whatever came, she would face it standing. The riders burst into the valley, not her father this time, but soldiers, a full patrol, armed and ready for battle. At their head rode a captain she didn't recognize, young and stern-faced, with the bearing of a man determined to prove himself. Walking Bear met them as before, but this time the soldiers didn't stop at the entrance. They rode in, fanning out, rifles at the ready. "By order of the United States Army," the captain announced. "This illegal settlement is to be disbanded immediately. All residents will surrender weapons and prepare for relocation." "On whose authority?" Walking Bear demanded. "On the authority of the federal government. You're harboring fugitives and renegades. This ends now." Margaret Rose felt her world tilting. They'd been found out, sold out, and now everything they'd built would be destroyed. She looked for Joseph, found him positioned strategically, ready to fight but hoping for another way. That's when she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward, into the open, addressing the captain directly. "Sir, might I speak with you?" The captain's eyes narrowed. "You're the Bennett girl, the one who ran off with savages. Your father's been making quite a noise about you in town." "I'm Margaret Rose," she said firmly. "Just Margaret Rose. And yes, I left my father's house. But look at me. Captain, do I appear to be held against my will? Do I seem abused or corrupted?" The captain studied her, taking in her healthy appearance, her clear eyes, her straight spine. "You've been living with heathens. Ma'am, it's not proper." "What's not proper?" she said, her voice carrying clearly. "Is a father beating his daughter in the street while good Christian folk watch and do nothing? What's not proper is being told you're worthless every day of your life. These people you call heathens showed me more Christianity in 3 months than my town showed in 20 years. Murmurs rose from the soldiers. Some of them shifted uncomfortably. "Be that as it may," the captain said, though with less certainty. "The law is clear. This settlement is illegal. These Indians are off the reservation without permission." "And if they return to the reservation?" Margaret Rose asked. "What waits for them there? Starvation? Disease? Death?" She stepped closer, close enough to see the youth in the captain's face, the uncertainty beneath the uniform. "You're a good man. I think you follow orders because you believe in justice. But is this justice? The law. The law once said my mother's people could own my father's people." Maria called out, her voice strong. Was that justice? The law changes, Captain, but right and wrong, those are written on the heart. The captain looked around at the assembled people, Apache, Mexican, white, all standing together, all ready to defend their home. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. Old men stood with dignity despite their bent backs. This wasn't a war camp. It was a community. "I have my orders," he said, but the conviction was leaving his voice. "Then follow them," Joseph said, stepping forward to stand beside Margaret Rose. "But know what you destroy. Know that you scatter families who harm no one. Know that you send people to their deaths for the crime of wanting to live free." The captain was young, perhaps 25, with eyes that hadn't yet learned to close themselves to suffering. He looked at Margaret Rose again. "Is this truly what you choose? To live here among them?" "They are not them," she said softly. "They are us. We are a family built not on blood but on choice. And yes, I choose this. I choose them. I choose him." She reached for Joseph's hand, lacing their fingers together publicly for the first time. "I choose love over law. Captain, wouldn't you?" The captain sat silent on his horse for a long moment. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley. Finally, he spoke. "I'll need to report that we found the settlement abandoned, that the residents had moved on before we arrived, scattered to the winds." He looked directly at Walking Bear. "I suggest you make that truth by the time I return in 1 week's time. Understood?" Walking Bear nodded slowly. "We understand." The captain turned his horse, then paused. "Miss Margaret Rose, your father has legally disowned you. You should know that. You're free in the eyes of the law now. What you do with that freedom," he shrugged, "that's not my business." As the soldiers rode away, the valley erupted in voices. Anger, fear, relief, sorrow. They would have to leave, find a new place, start over, but they would do it together. "You were magnificent," Joseph told Margaret Rose quietly. "I was terrified." She admitted, "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite fear." He squeezed her hand. "You saved us from bloodshed today." Walking Bear approached them. "We have much to do and little time, but first," he smiled at their joined hands, "it seems we have something to celebrate. In times of ending, we must also mark beginnings." That evening, as the community packed and prepared, they also celebrated, by firelight, with the mountains as witness. Margaret Rose and Joseph spoke vows, not in any church, not blessed by any minister the outside world would recognize, but sacred nonetheless. Maria sang. Walking Bear spoke words in Apache that needed no translation. The children threw wildflower petals. "I take you as my equal," Joseph said, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd. "To walk beside, not behind, to share joy and sorrow, plenty and want. To be my partner in all things until the mountains fall." "I choose you freely," Margaret Rose replied, her voice strong and clear. "To stand with in peace and trouble, to build a life of respect and tenderness, to love without owning, to hold without binding, until the stars forget their names." They sealed their vows with a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and promise, of endings and beginnings, of freedom hard-won and consciously chosen. Later, as the fire burned low and people drifted away to continue packing, Margaret Rose stood with her new husband, looking out over the valley they would leave tomorrow. "Where will we go?" she asked. "North, probably. There are other hidden places. We'll find one, and we'll build again. As many times as we must." He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "That's what love does, Margaret Rose. It builds and rebuilds, no matter how many times the world tries to tear it down." She thought of her mother, dead 20 years, and wondered if she would approve of this unconventional path her daughter had taken. She thought of her father, alone with his whiskey and his rage, and felt only pity. She thought of Dry Creek, where she'd been property, and of this valley, where she'd become a person. "I'm not afraid," she said, and meant it. "No," Joseph agreed. "You haven't been afraid for some time now? You just needed to realize it." As dawn approached, bringing with it the need to move on, Margaret Rose Bennett, now Margaret Rose in truth, belonging fully to herself, stood ready. She had found love not in the cage of tradition, but in the wild freedom of choice. She had discovered that sometimes enough spoken at the right moment can change everything. And she had learned that home isn't a place, but a people. And love isn't ownership, but liberation. The bruises had long since faded from her skin, but more importantly, they had faded from her spirit. In their place grew something stronger than fear, more lasting than pain, the unshakable knowledge that she was worthy of love, capable of courage, and free to choose her own path. And as the first light touched the mountains, painting them gold with promise, she chose to walk forward into whatever came next, hand in hand with a man who had seen her worth when the whole world looked away. Surrounded by a family built on choice rather than chance, she was free, she was loved, she was home, and that was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're enjoying these tales. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts on Margaret Rose's journey. Your stories and responses mean everything to us.